Hello, World Singers! My name is Brooke.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is Cosmere Conversations. Welcome back to the pod, everyone. Little did you know, this is Tyler's birthday podcast.
And during the summer months when our birthdays do fall, we try to ask that you, the listener, give a review, give a shout out, tell a friend, share the Cosmere Conversations, write a little something something on the iTunes or the Pocket Cast or the Stitcher. I know there's some Stitcher people out there. Wherever you can review us or star us or share us, please do so, and we will consider that a birthday high five from you, digitally/virtually.
Thanks in advance.
Because we know you're all going to do it. That's how amazing that you are.
Now let's get into the podcast proper, because we have an awesome episode for you today. I'm pretty sure this is the first time that we've ever done like a standalone podcast specifically focused on Her Majesty, Queen Jasnah Kholin of Alethkar.
We've talked about her. We've loved her from afar, from close up. We have speculated she has been our leading radiant, or like our most advanced radiant, so we're often saying, well, except for Jasnah.
Yeah, she's certainly the subject of a lot of speculation.
And therefore, we need to condense all of that speculation into one place and time for you, traveling through time right now, as you do. Because Jasnah Kholin is definitely one of the most important characters introduced early on in the Stormlight Archive, clearly in a position of power in our present day Stormlight Archive. We believe going to get a standalone book in the second half as a possibility. So
yeah, she is supposed to be the, main character of one of the second half Stormlight books. And so as such, we are getting a little bit more about her in each book leading up to that time when she gets to be in the spotlight.
Before we dive deep into Jasnah Kholin, let's hear from some fans who reached out and left us some feedback either about general stuff or our most recent episode on the emulsifiers. From
Vince H., he said, so I was listening to this episode, meaning our emulsifier episode, and thought of a thought another podcast had presented. So we know that each shard presumably has a tone, and so on those lines, could Adonalsium combine to be the equivalent of a chord? And pushing that further, assuming more Adonalsium level beings are out there, could the God Beyond actually be the orchestra of the universe?
This is a fractal nature that this is when you keep playing it out, you're just like, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it wraps all the way back down to the beginning and becomes the thing that started it all. Yes, to everything. Speculation? Sure. Why not? Could be. I don't know. I think that there is a lot that will continue to be learned about the tones of the different shards. Mm-hmm. And how those play together. Could that be like a chord when it is struck all at once? And that's just like, Adonalsium.
I do really love the idea of the Cosmere being this cosmic symphony of sounds. It's just such a beautiful idea. I think the question of like, is Adonalsium like quote unquote the God Beyond, or like, is Adonalsium the capital G endgame God, or is there something greater than Adonalsium? That's a very interesting question. I think, at least at this point, that the Adonalsium entity is the capital G endgame God of the Cosmere, because Cosmere, I think, is like the whole cosmos. Like, I don't think, we're not just talking about one system and like there's more out there.
For the purposes of the story world that we know so far, it seems like the Cosmere is a self-contained universe, even though it's only like the size of a dwarf galaxy in time and space.
Sure.
Like, you don't think there are other galaxies out there outside of the Cosmere that would be like Cosmere B or Cosmere C.
I think by saying Cosmere, it is automatically like incorporating all of existence. And so if Adonalsium is like big god of the Cosmere, it's big god of everything, is my thought now.
So you would be like, chord can exist, but not the symphony. According to this theory that
according to this theory, I would say that the chord would be the end, the biggest.
I think this is interesting because Brandon is a Latter-day Saint who practices the Mormon religion. And in that religious belief, God, who will use the word universe instead of Cosmere, just to try to simplify, God is actually not the only one capable of doing what God does.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you, as an individual, can actually ascend to have your own godlike position. So, like, you could be an
like a shard?
Yeah. Well, see, okay, so that's the difference.
But no, you can be like a full Adonalsium.
You could be a full Adonalsium, and I am very badly interpreting Mormon theology, so everybody can yell at me about Mormon theology. However, in a very broad sense, a mortal person living on the world right now could theoretically, based on their deeds in both this life and all the lives, blah, 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 could theoretically be the god of their own universe.
Is it like a parallel timelines kind of thing, or...
You would have the functional powers that God has over this universe. So, like, you create everything, and, you snap your fingers, let there be light, and that is your universe. So, like a multiverse type of situation? Yeah. So, I think that in that instance, there would be multiple Adonalsiums, and there could be a symphony if you consider the multiverse to be the possible reality. For practical purposes, I think it's probably good to keep it focused on the Cosmere as like the biggest thing.
Yeah.
But, there's always a question of what else could be out there. And I think that there's also like the limitations that an author sets are probably good on their universe. Like, sure, there might be a multiverse, but do I need to get to that in this series of books about the Cosmere? No. So I'm just going to not talk about it at all.
We also heard from a couple people weighing in about different emulsifiers that they have seen or they think act as emulsifiers throughout the Cosmere. Clarissa pointed out Ciri and Susebron. She says, now that he is healed, they are a really powerful pair born out of bridging a gap. I think that's a great call. And then my little brother, Aaron, also weighed in to say Ciri and Vivenna act as emulsifiers between Idris and Hallandren. So lots of emulsifiers in Warbreaker.
I really have loved this concept of the emulsifier and like bringing that to bear on more aspects of the Cosmere. So thanks to everyone, siblings and not, who reached out. Lastly, we have just a far-fetched theory from good friend Ryan, who is a new listener to the pod, but did the thing that you do sometimes when you binge listen to a series. So heavy dose of Cosmere conversations all at once. We appreciate that.
Hi, Ryan. Welcome to the pod.
And he presented the idea that Dalinar would become Terravodium's champion in order to guarantee that his side, or what he views as like the good side, was victorious in the Cosmere War.
So he would like throw the match, essentially?
Basically. Like if you think of throwing the match in order to win the war, maybe Dalinar pulls a Marsh, and I just want to make this small connection, but remember, like, Marsh goes into the situation where he's eventually turned into an Inquisitor and under the control of Ruin with the mindset that he can be a corrupting influence. First is just like trying to get into the Inquisitors group, and then as an actual Inquisitor, he says like, I'm going to remain dutiful.
He's like
and
waiting for the one moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's something that Dalinar is coming upon, his one moment where it makes sense to shift the entire Cosmere around him and his choice, and that could involve losing the battle for Roshar, but maybe gaining something bigger. So many questions that we don't know the answer to. So
interesting thought. I like it. I'm always looking for interesting thoughts about that final battle.
I think it will be important to keep that final battle in mind when we start talking about Jasnah, and let's do that now.
Oh, yes, Jasnah. We get more of Jasnah than we have seen before in this book, and yet still not enough. We do learn a little bit more about Jasnah as a person, her inner life, but we still don't know a whole lot about her history. We've only got a couple of tiny little hints.
I think one of the things that we definitely picked out in our reread of the first 3 books of Stormlight Archive, and that I was looking for in Rhythm of War, and it was like confirmed, is what happened to Jasnah in her past that maybe was part of her quote unquote breaking moment that then set her up.
Allowed her to be a Radiant.
And we definitely have the theme of post-traumatic stress from all of the different moments in these Irradiants' life and our characters' lives. And it seems like Jasnah had something with a mental break of some kind, some type of instance that led her to being institutionalized or whatever Roshar versions of a insane asylum. Like, they do not treat people who are suffering from mental illnesses good. And that's coming from Earth, where we also don't treat people that well. And historically was worse. Like, I'm saying worse. Insane asylum because, like, that's the bad version. Yeah. But that's like 20th century. That was us being as kind as people then, you know, in the 1950s. And they started to be phased out around that time and into the 1970s. But for literally generations and generations, the quote unquote kind thing to do was to send away people who were dealing with various different physical and mental disorders to be like isolated in prisons, strapped down, all the type of terrible stuff we see on Roshar. Yeah. But that was the quote unquote best they could do for them. And maybe you would and I would have problems with that today, but historically, it was way worse. Like, you go back 500 years, and it was much, much worse for anyone who is suffering in almost any way. Suffering, not big in the history of humanity. It would just be like, if you suffer too much, humanity just kind of like pushes you to the side. And I was like, we can't deal with that. That's too great. And Roshar has kind of done the same thing with just like, as we learn from Kaladin's perspective, the mentally ill are often just isolated and imprisoned, and maybe they get better. And I think that's what happened to Jasnah. I think something like that, she was exposed to something like that as a very young age.
It certainly seems like it, which is kind of the juicy tidbit that we have. I thought it was really interesting in Rhythm of War. We actually see a little bit of how the events of Words of Radiance affected her. And it's so interesting because we almost always see Jasnah from a third-party perspective, and she always seems confident and put together and in charge. And you really, there's like that one moment when Shallan sees her like with her guard down, and that's basically
she dies.
it.
Well, and then the moment after that is like when the ship sinks and Jasnah's like thrown off into Shadesmar. It's a moment of realness, I think, and importance for Jasnah. But as you were saying, we always see her from the perspective of someone else, where she looks like the most powerful Radiant in any room that she happens to, even standing next to other Radiants, Jasnah's held up as like, oh yeah, she's better than me.
We don't really ever see her in any state of like vulnerability, scared, angry. Well, maybe angry, but like, you know, scared or vulnerable, we don't really ever see. And so it's really cool in Rhythm of War to get to see from her perspective and learn that she is actually kind of suffering from PTSD from that episode where she is attempted to be assassinated. She flees to Shadesmar. She gets trapped in Shadesmar, is like desperately trying to return to Earth to like warn everybody about this terrible event. And we see that effect on her, which I think is really cool because we, after that happens, all we see from her is just kind of, same old Jasnah.
Yeah, the return of the triumphant is basically how it's approached. But this is what I'm saying is I think that all of her different traumas are stacking on one another, because in this moment that we know happened to her, she's trapped in Shadesmar. But then the other moment that happened when she was young, I think she was like trapped in Roshar's version of their insane asylums, in that terrible treatment. And so there's something about being unable to act as you want to, being held down maybe physically, or trapped in a place like Shadesmar where you can't get out. That feeling of being out of control is definitely something that Jasnah is processing, and it has a very specific impact on her mentality today, even though she's radiant, even though she's the queen.
For example, when she is at war, she specifically chooses her like base camp building as the building that has a second floor so that she can be more safe from spies and assassins. And then also, quote, she had a boat waiting on the other side, as close to analogous to this location as Shadesmar would allow. She kept stores of stormlight in the pockets of her dressing gown, which she now wore. She would never again be caught unaware. She would never again be left struggling in Shadesmar without proper resources, forced to spend weeks hunting a perpendicularity. End quote.
And I want to just follow that one up with the quote from Wit, because this provides us a good perspective from someone that we don't necessarily trust, but we at least think has a broader view on things. And Wit says this about Jasnah, quote, "You are poised, you are smart, and you are always ready with a ploy. But when each of those things fails you, Jasnah, you are, above all else, paranoid." End quote. To me, those two things demonstrate the consequences of all of these different traumas that Jasnah has dealt with. She is suffering from a paranoia of control, or a lack of control in other moments, and trying to make up for that by creating a building or selecting a building.
Yeah, she never wants to be powerless again. She is literally carrying power, Stormlight, with her, even in her pajamas, like to bed.
That's a great point. Like how afraid you have to be. You might hear someone about, oh, I sleep with a gun next to my bed or something like that. It's like, man, how afraid are you? What happened to you to make you feel so vulnerable that you're sleeping with a weapon? Jasnah is going to bed with the most powerful weapon that we know of, which is Stormlight. That's a great way to look at it, is she's just terrified and paranoid.
This is a weird connection to make, but this is basically the scene from Gone with the Wind with Scarlet in the garden, like, I will never be hungry again. This is Jasnah's, I will never be powerless again.
Yeah, and in both of those scenes with Scarlet as a character and with Jasnah,
they've been through shit.
They have a arc that we would see as kind of like triumphant. They're overcoming their problems and they're like moving for you.
Debatable in terms of Scarlet,
there
but
is
hopefully Jasnah works out better.
But I think that the concept of like, I have been removed from situations of control over my own life. Scarlet because of the war and everything that was going wrong, and Jasnah also because of war and everything that's going wrong.
And in both instances, like, that moment really signifies a cutting off of emotion and like connection with others. Like, really from that moment on, I'm just going to keep going back to Scarlet because that's what I know. And we don't know that much about Jasnah yet. But from that moment on, for Scarlet anyway, she is singularly focused on that one goal of like, never, ever will this happen to me ever again. And I don't care what I have to do for that to be the case, period. And she does some like questionable things because of that. And so that might be the same case with Jasnah. We certainly see that her ability to connect and again be like vulnerable with other people is questionable or compromised. And I'm interested to see how this intense paranoia affects her decision making.
Because I think her main decision that we saw, again, not getting a whole bunch of scenes with Jasnah, but one that we did see is her battle moment.
Yeah.
When she is fully entrenched in full shard plate, is using her shard blade, is on the front lines, in the thick of it, however you want to describe it. She chooses to be there, A, because she wants legitimacy in the eyes of others by like leading battle and not having anyone try to undercut her with like, you've never seen real battle, blah, blah, blah. No, she stays out there for hours. She goes into a Dalinar-like trance of killing and slaughter and handles it differently, processes it differently, but she is purposefully putting herself in the situation where clearly you're not in full control on a battlefield. Even if you are radiant, even if you are a shard bearer, you can still die. You can still be killed. It happens all the time in these stories when it's
and
just
she has a moment like that on the battlefield where she gets a little bit panicked.
Overwhelmed. Yeah. And I think that that is such an interesting example of Jasnah trying to process these different feelings and emotions and traumas that she has dealt with.
But also, like, what a great leader to, like, she specifically says that in order to lead her people, she wants to better understand what it's like to be in war so that, like, she gets it before she just orders, you know, her troops to go somewhere. She wants to really viscerally understand what war means on, like, a personal level.
Yeah, it's a very Ned Stark-esque moment. Although he wasn't necessarily talking about war, he was talking about being willing to carry out justice as like the king of an empire and like do the deed yourself. You know, if you're going to execute someone, like swing the sword. And Jasnah clearly would have no problem swinging the sword.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get to that.
But I think that part of this actually comes before she was radiant, or at least I don't want to pinpoint an age for when Jasnah becomes a radiant. I think like Shallan, she may have been flirting with a spren for a real long time. But her chosen life's path before radiance is as a Veristatilian. And I think that's a made-up word, but
it's a real thing.
Way to go, Brandon. Just picking out real words. So someone who is a Veristatilian would do what, Brooke?
She has dedicated her life and her scholarship to finding the truth of history. So this thing that like Jasnah has been pursuing for all of her adult life, she comments that like it's kind of pointless now because Ash and Taln are here and like she can just ask them. And it's such just an interesting commentary on history and like the way that we understand history and the truth about history. So we get this quote: "The challenge of Stormhold? Oh, Ash had been there. King Iolid had just been drunk. The Treaty of Four Nights? A delaying tactic intended to position the enemy for a betrayal." End quote. And so there's like all these things that, you know, they've spent hundreds, maybe thousands of years like interpreting and trying to decide like what it meant and probably assigning all types of, you know, honorable or noble or grand
and
ideas.
If Rosharian scholars are anything like Earth scholars, then there is someone out there who spent their entire life reading every scrap of information about the Treaty of Four Nights.
Yeah.
Like really just getting about, like, specific.
What was the strategy here? This brilliant idea that this person had. And like, oh, no, he was just drunk.
Yeah, exactly. I think this does bring up another connection to what Jasnah is pursuing, because history and the teaching of history or the passing on of history is very much a thing in flux, a story to be told. And through that story, you can have a lot of control or a lot of power. And if you are wanting to, for example, males in society, in a patriarchal society, they can use the story of history to empower themselves and disempower the female population. I think that Jasnah's life's mission about trying to find the truth of things is also an element of like trying to take back some of the control from these people and these organizations and these religious scholars who have an influence on the study of history, because the scholars are also tied to the religion, which are tied to the politics. And it's just like all of this stuff. And she was like, no, I'm going to be the knife that cuts through and just sees things as they are, as truth. And what she realizes because of Ash and Taln and all the past colliding with their present is that almost her attempt at a control or an understanding was maybe impossible. I feel like it would be destabilizing to be Jasnah, to feeling like
totally.
I was told all these things. I knew that they were not true or lies or propaganda, and I'm going to go and study and figure everything out.
And then she's like just as wrong as they are.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like no matter how hard someone as brilliant as Jasnah was trying, it still is just immediately undercut as soon as you can find out like, oh no, that guy was drunk. He was just drunk all the time and completely threw off everyone around him because he was so drunk. And it's just like, well, that is not what's in the books. Nobody writes about that, even in the little notes that the women might put in the women's script. Like those types of things are just lost to time and lost to history. And so amid all of these destabilizing aspects of Jasnah's life and the greater war on Roshar, she finds a unlikely romance in Wit. And I feel like this is such a weird, stabilizing thing. It is like on a sailboat, totally forgot the name, but you have the big sail, and then you often have like some smaller sails that just do a job of stabilizing the bigger sail. And they might seem to be working in opposites, but it's actually about like balancing out and making sure that you sail in the direction that you want to go. I feel like that is almost what Wit is allowing, or part of in Jasnah's life, is like a stabilizing presence amid all of this chaos.
It is an interesting relationship that is both surprising but also makes complete sense. She says, quote, "She found the way he spoke fascinating. After all this time and all her worries, here was one who was her intellectual equal, perhaps her superior. She didn't trust him, of course, but that was part of what intrigued her." End quote.
There's always that question about like, what is it that attracts you to someone else? Is it their...
Sometimes it's the mystery.
Sometimes it's just, not being able to fully understand that other person and how they're presenting.
I mean, and Jasnah as a scholar is so interested in learning, right? And so like someone like Wit who presents such an opportunity for learning such a vast array of things. In that scene with Wit, he makes some very interesting comments about the contest of champions. I reread that scene and I thought these were interesting. Quote, "Because he knows, same as I'm telling you, that the contest won't only be about who can stab the hardest with their spear."
What will it be about then?
"Same thing it's always about, Jasnah," Wit said. "The hearts of men and women." End quote.
This to me is one of those big moments of like, listen to Hoyd and realize Kaladin is not going to be the champion. He specifically says it's not about someone who can stab with a spear.
This is what I've been saying the whole time. Like, I don't think this challenge is like actually about a sword fight. I think it's going to be something else. And so I love that Wit is backing me up on that.
Of course, he's an unreliable narrator. And
I know, but
no idea
still.
what it's going. I agree. I do think that there is going to be a huge subversion of our expectations when it comes to the quote unquote contest of champions.
Yeah.
Like when you hear that, you are thinking the Game of Thrones-esque, the Viper versus the Mountain, the very like classic duel with two people standing there going swords to swords. Who's the best? Is it Jaime Lannister or that other dude with the thorns and the like? I don't know all their names, and because that is what you expect. And with the death rattles that we have talked about, with the different foreshadowing of some unexpected moment that comes about because of this contest of champions, I definitely believe that we have to look beyond and look to what Hoyd is saying about this isn't going to be one with like well-placed
Stabby,
spear strike.
stabby.
Yeah. That's actually the technical term. You've been stabby-stabbied.
Yes.
And the contest is now over.
Let's continue with Jasnah's relationships. I'm pretty sure this is the first time that we have like meaningfully seen Jasnah and her mother interact.
They talk about each other in
Yes.
other scenes.
And we may have seen them like from across the room embrace when
Yeah.
Jasnah first gets
Hello,
back.
mother.
But like I don't think have had a full scene with the two of them. So this feels like a very important like Bechdel test type moment. Like, why did it take so long for the daughter and her mother to have one scene together?
And they recognize the awkwardness in the scene, which is the best part.
Great.
Is just like realizing exactly what has happened between the two of them when they say, quote, "Storms," Yasna said under her breath. "Mother, are we really so awkward that we embrace like teenagers meeting a boy for the first time?" End quote. That's harsh. Like, teenagers are awkward. That if you had that relationship with your mother, that would feel very, very strange to most people. And I think that is the relationship between Navani and Yasna.
They are incredibly different people. Very, very different people. And I think that Yasna's past, her mysterious past, probably has something to do with like her willingness to, again, be vulnerable or like be close to her mother. But also like sometimes, you know, as a parent or a child, you don't have a lot in common. Like sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and sometimes it rolls down a hill. Like it's just how it is sometimes. And so I think this is kind of cool to explore a different type of parent-child relationship. It's not that they don't love each other. It's just that they don't necessarily see eye to eye or like understand each other. And like what an interesting thing that is when you're like, I made this person or this person made me, and yet I don't understand them at all.
I think it is probably very connected to what happened in Yasna's youth. And I definitely think that there could be a moment of like Navani was looking at Jasnah and Jasnah was looking at her mom, and Navani made a decision that Jasnah did not agree with, and that created the everlasting divide between them. But I do think that this is a very important relationship because it's also one of the only parental and offspring relationship where the offspring is also a fully fledged adult. I think the next closest is like Adolin and Dalinar, where he's like starting
Adolin's like, just starting to get there.
But like Jasnah has a full career. She's
She's
well
a grown
respected.
woman.
Yeah, exactly. And that is different in many respects. There's not the stereotypical version, which is like, well, when the daughter starts to have children of her own, then she will understand what it is like. In this relationship, it's different, but I feel like Yasna in many ways is kind of forging the path that Navani didn't. Like Navani chose the political marriage and went down that kind of like in Rosharian history.
You could say chose. She probably didn't have a lot of better choices.
And clearly Jasnah benefits and is able to choose different because of Navani and all of those things, yes. But I think that was probably an influencing element, is if you're a young, rebellious Jasnah, like willing to break away from maybe people who didn't treat you right or you think didn't treat you right as a young person, the thing that you would do is try to be the opposite of your mother. You look at your mom and you're just like, I'm not going to be that. I'm not going to go marry some warlord, blah, 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 and sit back and organize dishes or whatever. You know, just the meanest stuff you can think about your mom. Navani's great, obviously. But from a young person's perspective, I can totally see how that would send Jasnah on the path that now eventually leads her to this moment of complete awkwardness with her own mother.
Yeah, and we have to remember that Jasnah has, for some people, what may be really different ways of communicating affection. We see that in her relationship with Wit, and we see that again in her relationship with her mom. Like Jasnah might never be, the big hugging type like that quote illustrated, but she says, quote, "Thank you for always being you Despite the rise of kingdoms and the fall of peoples, I don't think you can understand how much your constant strength means to me.
What an unusual exchange. Yet Navani found herself smiling. She squeezed Jasnah's hand, and that moment together, seen through the mask, became more precious than 100 awkward embraces. End quote.
Yeah, so, even though they are so different, even though there is always some strife, I think, between parents and children as the, growing process happens, even through all of that, hopefully, anyway, like we can get to this kind of point where despite our differences, we can respect each other, and the fact that even though they are so different, don't understand each other at all, Jasnah can say, thank you for always being you. Like, I think that is just a huge declaration of love.
Yes, it definitely shows growth and development in their relationship from probably what it was before the Stormlight Archive books began. But I do find the use of seen through the mask as an interesting choice of words that Navani has. And I believe that Shallan used in that moment as well, of Jasnah is putting on...
She always has her guard up.
Exactly. And that goes back to what Hoyd is talking about you're paranoid. For example, Shallan in the very first description of Jasnah was talking about how she always looks so beautiful and delicate.
Yeah,
but then
she's like the perfect Vorin beauty.
Even though she doesn't respect a lot of Vorinism, and she definitely has a bone to pick with the patriarchal society that exists, she goes through all of the different motions to fit the ideal to put on the mask.
And right before this moment with Navani observes basically how every choice that Jasnah makes is calculated for a specific effect. Like everything that she does, from her hair to her clothing to the way that she travels, all is a game plan. Like none of it is just because Jasnah wants to do this. It's all for a very, very specific reason, basically to assert power. And like you said, control.
Yes, taking back some of that control.
To be able to control any situation that she is in through any means necessary.
Yeah, like a woman choosing an outfit in a professional setting, many different women could choose many different outfits for many different reasons, but Jasnah would always be about projecting the confidence and poise and power and control that she wants in any given situation. I find that, as well as her relationship with Hoyd and with Navani, and how we get these kind of moments of dropping the mask and then seeing the mask again, because let's talk about a situation that was a very mask-oriented situation. One was fighting in the battle. Like that was part about building up a mask of respectability and being able to understand what actual soldiers are dealing with. But the one that I think is most mask intensive that we see here is the confrontation with Ruthar, the other High Prince.
Such a good scene.
Now, Ruthar is being a dick. He is trying to undercut Jasnah with the same patriarchal stuff that we were talking about. So Ruthar is just really laying it on thick with the misogyny, and he says, quote, "I didn't say anything when she was made queen. Other nations have queens. It's a disgrace. Dalinar writing, he might as well put on a hava and start painting. We deserve the judgments of the Almighty after giving the throne to a godless..." End quote. Obviously, he's going to finish that line before he is interrupted by Jasnah. But this venom that Ruthar is projecting, not just at Jasnah, but also at Dalinar and at the entire...
Just like his world is changing.
Yes.
It is becoming less patriarchal in the way that he knows.
Less Ruthar focused. Like Ruthar was really rocking the old world, and he does not want any changes to that system. His world is basically breaking down. And to be fair to everyone else, their world is also breaking down.
Exactly.
There's a desolation and a massive Cosmere war coming. Like everyone's war is breaking it down, and Ruthar chooses to act like a dick. Other people choose to try to take the next step and be better. And so Jasnah turns that around on him.
Well, that whole rant was actually specifically calculated and planned for by Jasnah. She baits him into saying that, like,
Publicly.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure she's heard the mutterings around and whatever, and she decides to just address it head on. So she's like in the battle tent, kind of making a big show of talking to the generals and like giving input about the battle and stuff, kind of like looking at him out of the corner of her eye. And then he makes, he breaks down, can't take it anymore, gotta say all of this crap. Dalinar steps in and is like, hey man, I don't think you want to do this, because wit obviously comes to Jasnah's defense, as the queen's wit should. And I think it's very interesting that the reasoning Dalinar uses is like, we know that wit is not really a normal wit. I don't think you should fight him. And he even says, quote, I'm not sure if you can kill him, end quote.
Definitely giving us a tiny bit of tidbit about wit that we should always like take out and, learn as much about Hoid as possible.
Well, and just the fact that like Dalinar is now recognizing this.
Exactly. But I think that the way that Jasnah then turns the screws on wit, basically, she is ratcheting up the volume, the pressure that wit is using in his insults, throwing them out more and more. And she's like, wit, more. Like, hurt him badly. Try to make him as upset as possible so that there will then be this moment that she wants where they are challenged to a trial by combat. Mm-hmm. And she is doing all of this purposefully. She has her cousin, Renarin, hanging out in the sidelines. She brought him specifically and told him specifically, do not mention to anyone, including Dalinar, why you are here, but you will stand here until I look over at you, and then you will do the thing that your radiant powers allow you to do. And so he knows something bad's about to happen. But Jasnah is creating this elaborate ruse to get to the moment where she is the one who will act as her own champion.
Well, I think that there is a question of, like, does she know that Hoid is unable to hurt other things or, like, to kill? We know that that is a weird thing about Hoid. He has some restriction in his ability to cause pain.
We believe it's connected to something about him holding the Dawn Shard, or the specific Dawn Shard that he held. But
and we're specifically reminded of that quality of Hoid's right before this scene. He's talking to Dalinar and he comments that he wishes he could still eat cow, which we know, word of Brandon, he is vegetarian because of this prohibition on like hurting things. And so I wonder if Jasnah knows that and like they planned for that in this strategy where wit is like, fine, I'll nominate a champion, you don't have to fight me, and of course is like, my champion will be the queen.
And then the queen steps forward, pulls Hoid's sword out of its scabbard. We don't believe it has any magical properties, but anytime you're touching Hoid's stuff, I don't know if
we've ever seen it drawn before.
Yeah, he's always, not always, but he's often shown wearing a sword, especially on Roshar. But we have no confirmation of any magical sword aspects, but she draws the sword and immediately stabs Ruthar, killing him, or getting him as close to death as possible.
And then Renarin revives him.
And then Renarin brings him back, which is just the ballsiest move that you can make pretty much anywhere. Just like, I'm going to kill you, you are going to die, and then because I am so nice to you, will bring you back to life.
She gets to both kill him and have him be alive to face the consequences of his actions.
Which are then extreme. Like, she removes him from land and title.
Everything away.
Like, disinherits people. And then
she's like, well, since you died, that means you forfeit everything.
Exactly. Everything moved, and she is the queen and gets to direct these things. But it's just a beautifully elaborate ruse that I think...
And then she immediately uses her own actions to justify a new law forbidding trial by combat.
saying, quote, "I will use my own unfortunate experience today as an example of why this is a terrible tradition. Ruthar's blood will be the last such spilled, and as we leave this era of barbarism, each and every attendant at court will know that Alethkar's first queen is a woman unafraid of doing what needs to be done, herself." End quote.
Baller.
This, to me, is the big mask that Jasnah is building now as queen, but maybe has been building all her life, and that some characters get to see through in those moments. But this is also what all kings and queens and rulers and presidents and everyone has to do in many respects, is like create this mask of authority, because if you don't appear to have it, then you won't actually have it. But maybe if the appearance is strong enough that you will have more authority and power.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to be careful about saying that, like, it's all a mask, because I think that there is a lot of the things that she's doing that are based in her true beliefs and desires and her true strength and competence. You know, like, I don't want to just say all of this power and authority is just a mask that she's putting on, because I think she is strong and powerful and intelligent, and, you know, and so in a way it's just that she is emphasizing those aspects of herself and de-emphasizing any of the softer sides of herself. So I just, you know, I want to be careful about saying that it's all a mask, because I think that she is a strong, powerful, intelligent, competent, good ruler person, and I want that to be known.
As do I. And I think it comes down to like how we're using the definition of mask, because as I said, I think everyone, including our characters, Dalinar and whatnot, as well as all leaders, politicians everywhere that have ever existed, are all doing this game of creating their mask of authority. You can even argue that like countries in general are making masks like of legitimacy of their, you need to believe in what America stands for, or what the United Kingdom stands for, or what blah, 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 insert your country here stands for. And that is, in many respects, a version of a mask that you are putting on and being like, this is what we are holding up. This is what we are emphasizing. And we are downplaying some of the other aspects. George Washington, total hero of the American Revolution. Slave owner, not so much. Don't talk about that part. But it's what Jasnah is doing as well. She is creating the mythology, the history,
and she's at least like using, we can call it a mask of power, but she's at least using her mask of power to put forward, I mean, I guess what we would call her more democratic ideals. For example, making sure that people know that the first queen of Alethkar was a fucking baller and like a badass, and she didn't need her hand held. And we hear a lot actually about her sort of vision for Alethkar, which is quite different and is one of the reasons that Ruthar is so scared and shaken and confused about the way that their world is changing.
Yes, and so this is what going forward, because we're going to talk about all of these different things that she wants to do, I guess I want to talk about Jasnah's philosophy and then Jasnah's actions to accomplish the philosophy, because a person like Jasnah, who's not quite what we here on Earth would label as sociopathic or psychopathic by any stretch of the imagination, but she's also very pragmatic and
in many ways she is unencumbered by emotion.
Oh, that's great. Unencumbered by emotion is very Jasnah.
There's actually a note in my Kindle. I forget exactly what she says, but it's during a conversation with Dalinar. I think they're talking about the value of hope, and Jasnah is kind of, her perspective is that hope is for suckers, basically, and that like people make a lot of bad decisions when they are encumbered by emotion like hope. Mm-hmm. And I made this note that's just like, Jasnah is the opposite of odium ?
Yeah, I mean, she doesn't want passion.
And she is like the person that you want to go up against odium in some ways, because she's just really cuts through the bullshit, is not interested in any sentimentality or sympathy or passion, like really at all. She is all about just like intelligence and clear thinking.
And I believe that her philosophy or her vision of Roshar is probably something that more people would agree with, more people from Earth would agree with. Like, yeah, that's a good direction. And then the way that she tries to accomplish that, as demonstrated by the confrontation with Ruthar, is the mask that she thinks is the best at accomplishing her goals. So, like,
Always.
what did she want out of the confrontation with Ruthar? Probably not a small percentage, was just like dealing with someone who was a dick to you and misogynistic. But like the bigger thing, I believe, was this banning of trial by combat. Like that's probably what she actually wanted to accomplish.
I think that's a gross simplification, because I think Jasnah is incredibly intelligent, and this whole orchestrated scenario was the perfect problem solving of many different problems that she had, that she was able to kill like 3 birds with 1 stone, basically. Yes, she wanted to get rid of trial by combat. She also wanted to very publicly address any statements of misogyny or fear about the new Alethkar order. And 3, then more personally, this dude's been a dick to me. Let me get back at him. And she found this perfect way to do all 3 of those things in one sweep of her sword.
And it could be the perfect way, and it seems like a good way. I always wonder about like the ramifications of the way these people are acting.
Of course.
And I think from Dalinar as our main example of another leader on Roshar, a bunch of times he thinks he's doing the right thing, and that ends up getting half of his men killed. Mm-hmm. And if it was maybe a story about a different part of Roshar, that would just be seen as a colossal epic failure that then resulted in like the death or abandonment. Dalinar's entire kingdom could have just like crumbled after that moment if it was just a slightly different story, but instead he rises from the ashes like a phoenix and becomes a radiant. And I'm worried that some of our characters will make these big mistakes, a la Ned Stark, like not realizing how the Game of Thrones is played. Jasnah seems far more advanced than many of the Game of Thrones players.
Yeah.
And she basically can't die because she's a radiant. However, I am worried. I'm always worried when people are making these kinds of moves for politics and trying to manipulate everyone to do a certain thing and think a certain thing. And it's just like, you hope that works out the way that you're planning.
Just specifically talking about the differences that can be seen with when you get a different perspective and like how powerful perspective is. One thing that I thought was absolutely fascinating about Rhythm of War is the different perspective we got on Dalinar, because we're coming right off of Oathbringer, which is extremely heavily Dalinar focused, and it is such a powerful way for us to become incredibly empathetic for Dalinar, right? If anyone was like on the fence about Dalinar before Oathbringer, you come away from Oathbringer having just the most respect and admiration and love and sympathy for Dalinar. Like, he can do no wrong. Everyone loves him. And in Rhythm of War, we get from multiple different people's perspectives a different view of Dalinar and his decisions and his character, which I just think is so interesting. We're so like entrenched in that view of like, Dalinar is the best, put him on a pedestal. And then to get these other perspectives is fascinating. We see him a little bit more as the old guy on his way out, right? Like definitely a relic of the previous iteration of Alethkar, and the way that he reacts towards Adolin, talks to Adolin, behaves toward Adolin, the multiple kind of confrontations, but just like discussions and disagreements that he has with Jasnah in those ways. It just really seems like he is the poster boy for the old paradigms. And then we have these new young characters as hints of what Alethkar and Roshar are moving towards and like will be in the future.
And I think it just to make it a little Cosmere focused as well, I think that there are a lot of similarities to the Scadrian universe where Mistborn Era 1 then births Mistborn Era 2. I know there's a gap of time in that one, but the just concept of you have to kind of have these people with their story, the Kelsiers, and the world that exists for our characters in Era 2 is very different, and they are dealing with different challenges and different issues. One kind of needs and relies on the other, but they would also never approach problems the same way. Like, no one in Era 2 would act like Kelsier does in Era 1, and vice versa. I think that Dalinar is the Kelsier in that example, the character whose maybe time has passed, and all of these other characters are handling problems, whether it's Kaladin and the treating of people with mental illness, Jasnah and the way that she is leading, the multiple examples we have of like scholarship and power moving away from the shard bearers and the military side and moving more towards the technology. All of those different things are coming to a head, with many emulsifiers helping along the way. But I think Jasnah Kholin ideas for the future, as she presents them through Rhythm of War, are both a bold declaration and one of those things that I'm fearful for how hard you can push a system that's already on the verge of breaking in so many different ways.
So you just see through Dalinar's eyes, basically.
I think that, no, I don't really see through Dalinar's eyes.
Well, I'm just saying that's basically his argument to her is like, slow down.
Yes.
Actually,
of course.
let's read that quote.
Perfect. Quote, "I wish you'd slow down," Dalinar said. "I'm not completely opposed to the theory of what you're doing. It shows compassion. But
if we slow down, the past catches up to us. History is like that, always gobbling up the present." End quote.
So in practice, I agree with Jasnah. Like, you got to move, and history is like an anchor holding you down. You can't let the past catch up with you. Totally agree there. And then to honor Dalinar's perspective, the world is very much breaking apart around them. Their religion is breaking. Their gods are dying. The enemy that they once thought was controlled, it's like everything is just like falling in on itself, and it's all crumbling around them.
Yeah, but I agree with Yasna. This is the perfect time to make change, exactly because of that. And I feel like you have more faith in like not making change because it hasn't been too bad for you in the past. But anyone who's ever been a minority is like, no, we should definitely make change. Doesn't matter if the world is falling apart. This is the time for change. It will be better.
And that's what I'm saying. I agree with Jasnah in every respect in my real life. And in the story world, I'm very worried. Like, in our world, I'm less worried about all, because all the things you just mentioned, like, oh, that's just the patriarchy, just like holding everybody down. That's just the hierarchy of societies.
Well, maybe we should just slow down. Like, no, dude.
No, you're just a corporation just trying to make money. That's all you are. And I totally understand that. And that is the difference between maybe like 20-year-old me and now much, much older me.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's so wise and experienced now. But 20-year-old me was like, all drugs should be legalized. Like, you don't need to tell anybody what to do. Just live and let live, brother. And now I'm like, if you make drugs legal, then some people will purposefully try to addict other people in order to abuse them and make lots and lots of money. And that is terrible. And so I think that conservatism has a purpose in both Roshar and the regular world.
Obviously,
and Dalinar
moderation is always the key.
Generally speaking, though, I'm all aboard the Jasnah train. Like, I'd hitch it to her before basically any character on this planet. All of them are very suspect, let's be honest.
Just to put this all in context, this is a conversation between Yasna and Dalinar when she proposes a new law freeing all Alethi slaves.
Quote, "I forbid this," Dalinar said. "You can't simply free every Alethi slave. It would cause mass chaos."
"I wasn't aware," Yasna said, "that you could forbid the queen from taking action."
Dalinar continued to pace. "I cannot see reason in this, Yasna. the chaos this will cause.
Our lives are already in chaos, Yasna said. This is precisely the time to make sweeping changes, when people are already adjusting to a new way of life. The historical data supports this idea.
But why? Dalinar asked. You're always so pragmatic. This seems the opposite.
I seek the line of action that does the most possible good for the most people. This is in keeping with my moral philosophy.
I wish you'd slow down, and that's where we started. I think that the danger, of course, of a Yasnian philosophy is that it's very close to a full utilitarian philosophy, or a full Thanos, as you might call it. Like, if the best move to do to accomplish the most possible good for the most people is to destroy half of all life in the universe.
That's actually a pretty good call.
Yeah.
Yasna as Thanos.
Thanos and
no.
Jasnah have the same philosophy, and this is why I'm worried. Here we now understand why conservatism makes some sense in the world, because there is a balance that Dalinar is clearly accurate about. Ending slavery in a society that lives off of slavery.
Well, you have to have a plan for sure. You can't just say, no slaves and walk away.
And I think that
But Yasna strikes me as the kind of person who probably has a plan. Again, we've said a lot of positive things about Dalinar, but can we just take a moment to
He's advocating slavery.
And to acknowledge his hubris in telling Yasna he forbids her for doing something?
Well, that's always been Dalinar's problem.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I think that's the same exact issue that Dalinar had with Elhokar when Elhokar was in Yasna's position, is that everyone knows Dalinar is in charge. Not legally. Legally, Jasnah is now in charge, or Elhokar was in charge.
Yeah, but before we could say oh, it's fine because Elhokar's a bad king. And now it's oh, this wasn't about Dalinar trying to take over because Elhokar was a bad king. This is about Dalinar just always needing to have it his way.
Oh, I always thought it was the latter. I never thought it was actually about Elhokar. Elhokar's the excuse. Everyone is a bad king.
That's what I'm saying.
Dalinar's a bad king.
But now it's obvious that
Dalinar.
it was an excuse. Yeah. And we have to acknowledge Dalinar's flaws as well as his positives.
No, I think that is the exact same flaw that leads Dalinar to say, I'll be the champion. Obviously, I am going to fight for all of Roshar and all of the Cosmere. That's arrogance. The only way you get to that position, or maybe any position of power, I don't know. I'm not in a powerful position.
And
but you have to be a little arrogant.
Sometimes it's earned. He is a bondsmith. Look, you do have a lot of power. I get it.
But he's totally advocating for slavery here.
Yeah.
He's just of the opinion that, I think in the Game of Thrones books, the conversation that Khaleesi had with her small council that was led by Tyrion ended up basically along the same lines. Khaleesi saying we should end slavery right now, and then her council talking to her into some type of 5-year plan that slowly phased out the slaves and paid the slave owners in some money back to free the slaves. But then by year 2, all of that falls apart and the whole society has ripped itself back into what it was previously. And that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that there is going to be a inability to deal with all of these issues that need to be dealt with, but they can't even deal with the most basic, because there is a gigantic Cosmere war going on. So Jasnah has probably more work to do, because we've talked a lot about how Dalinar may not survive the end of Book 5, and Jasnah is the clear leader of Roshar after that. I mean, Navani is a bondsmith, and she's going to have an important role. But politically, Jasnah's in the best position at this point and is demonstrating how she is building her credibility and legitimacy to rule politically all of Roshar in one way or another. And so she's got a lot on her table, and I don't know how she's going to handle it all.
Well, she has plans to move their world in, again, a more democratic direction, and another way in which her philosophies are contrasted with Dalinar. Dalinar is shown in so many ways to be an authoritarian.
Yeah.
From his insistence upon Adolin looking and acting and dressing a certain way to his ideas about governance.
Yes.
Versus Jasnah. And the best quote that illustrates this is what Wit says to Dalinar's face about himself. Quote, "On the topic of monarchs, I will have you know that I find you to be an endearing despot. You're so pleasant, I almost don't find it horrifying that I'm living among a people willing to trust a single man with near absolute power over the lives of hundreds of thousands, while completely ignoring proper checks and balances upon his potential greed, jealousy, or ambition." End quote.
Love it.
You hit it out of the park, Wit. That's exactly it. Dalinar is an endearing despot, and I think we all need to acknowledge this.
Oh, yeah, I do. I 100% agree that Wit is so perfectly just like thrown the dart and nailed it with Dalinar. It's just
bullseye.
Like, yeah, and that is terrifying because this is why despots work. Like, this is the exact reason why for most of human history, even if you were talking less than hundreds of thousands of people that you're reigning over, even if you just got like a couple of tribes together or whatnot, it's ruled by some form of a despot, whether that is a military or like physically powerful one, guy with a big stick back in the caveman days, or a group of matriarchs who all control a society of people who live on the islands that is now present day Indonesia. Like, they're all forms of despots because they're all operating without proper checks and balances upon those potential greeds and jealousies and ambitions. And we like see how different people across history have tried to put in little checks and balances.
Well, and we see the problem with the checks and the balances too, which is what Dalinar brings up. He says, quote, "I just don't like how much bureaucracy Fen has to go through before anything gets done. The Azish are even worse. Why name your ruler an emperor if he has to get approval from a dozen different functionaries to do his job?"
"One is a constitutional monarchy, the other a scholarly republic," Yasna said, sounding amused. "What did you expect?"
"A king to be a king," he muttered, drinking the rest of his wine in one gulp.
"Both of their governments go back centuries," Yasna said. "They've had generations to refine their processes. We'd do well to learn from them." She eyed him, thoughtful. "The days of absolute power in one person's hands will likely soon pass us by. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm the last true Alethi monarch." End quote.
I think that's so interesting that she is like stating openly that she is trying to pave the way for a different type of governance in Alethkar.
It certainly is bold, and it's certainly would be a bigger benefit to the Cosmere to have a central planet, an important planet like Roshar, be governed in a effective and small d democratic way that would have ripples across the Cosmere instead of getting a war-torn society that's meant to be led by odium on a gigantic killing spree.
To Dalinar's point, though, like, there are times when it's very handy to be able to have one person in charge who can swiftly make decisions. And those times tend to be times like this where there are like big wars happening. So, little bit here, a little bit there.
It's always that line or that idea that history is written by the victors. If Yasna's ideas end up working out, she's going to look great. Be like the last true monarch.
She saved us
exactly,
from
and like set us off. She is going to become, let's imagine that all of these different things that she wants to accomplish work exactly as she wants, and going forward in history, she will become like Vin is in Scadrian history, like the beginning of a long and prosperous reign of wonderfulness and awesome, where there's like far more equality and like everything is different and better than it was in the past because of this one woman.
There's kind of a difference though, because we have Jasnah in charge of a country, Alethkar, and Dalinar as like humanity's ambassador to the divine.
Yeah,
basically.
holy man.
Because he is king of Urithiru, which is just like Knights Radiant home base. So it's not really the same. They do have like a division of power. And so they kind of have a balance, as we're talking about, of like Jasnah needing to take a more democratic approach to the governance of her specific country and like sewage and trash pickup and like all of the mundane things about running a country. And then Dalinar needing to be the like single point person who can make big decisions in this big cosmic way.
Yeah, let's read this last quote between the two of them on this topic. Quote, "A king ruling by the gauntlet and sword can easily see it slip away when he weakens. Compare this to the Azish system where a bad prime is unable to single-handedly ruin their government.
And a good one is unable to accomplish much," Dalinar said. End quote.
And that really is coming back to the same philosophical debates about political theology that people have been having far before our own country, the United States, even existed. And this is like the birth of the Enlightenment, when you had people beginning to question the traditional, at least in Western Europe, mode of government that was almost exclusively done by monarchs. And you had a bunch of bad monarchs, and you had people that were like the second son twice removed from this person who was born 1,000 years ago, and now we're listening to them, but they are kind of like insane and stuff, and they're in charge of everything and everyone, and they get to do whatever they want. And it's just like, it seems like a really bad system. And then on the other hand, as Dalinar points out, just be like, if you have a bureaucracy that's so encumbered,
yeah,
it's like trying to move the Titanic when you need to be as swift as a hummingbird.
Yeah.
Yes. And so I feel like we've reversed our roles here, as I started out presenting the more conservative, and now you're being like, you know what, checks and balances are good. We should probably... And I think that's important because these are the constant challenges that Jasnah as a political leader is going to face. And Dalinar, I think, is going to face less and less as he fades from the story, or at least the center part of the story on
Yeah,
Roshar.
I mean, he's already outside of the political realm and is consciously moving himself away from that role. He, poetically, he is kind of on a journey like up the chakras or through the zodiac, from physical through mental, emotional to spiritual. Common paradigm trajectory we see in many different ways, where he has gone from like a super Aries, aggressive, very physical oriented person through his like enlightenment period of using how to learn, use his mind and emotions. And now he is moving into the spiritual aspect, literally saying like, I need to learn more about my bondsmith powers, and like my future is in that realm, is in that deity power that I hold.
Jasnah's relationship with Dalinar and with Navani, and the way that it continues to develop, and she will of course always see them as role models and leaders in her personal life and in their world in general. But part of the Stormlight Archive, I definitely see as this new generation of characters.
Yeah, the changing of the guard.
Yeah. So it is Dalinar and Navani saying goodbye, and Jasnah, Adolin, Kaladin, all of our other characters stepping up to rule their world in this moment of change.
In different ways. Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. I think that's a big thing that is happening in Rhythm of War, and is one of the things that contributes to the like transitional feeling of the book as a whole, is that we do see, you know, Kaladin stepping into a different role and stepping in with different ideas about how mental health is handled. And we see Shallan stepping into a new iteration of understanding of herself, understanding of the greater Cosmere. We see Jasnah bringing all of these new political ideas, and we do start to see that like slow transition as time passes, which is one of the really cool and interesting things about series like the Stormlight Archive and about the Cosmere in general, is watching societies and worlds change over time. Yeah.
If you have any thoughts about what is the best form of political leadership on Roshar,
oh gosh,
I don't really care about your thoughts about Earth, just Roshar, or any place in the Cosmere. Let us know, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or you can become a patron on Patreon. You don't have to do any of those things, but you can definitely leave a review, star rating, write some things, share the podcast with someone else.
Just tell your friends.
It helps new people find the podcast, and then they get to have conversations, and that is lovely.
We don't want any Cosmere fans to be out in the cold like so many of us have been, just wishing for Cosmere friends to talk about the Cosmere with. Let's bring them all in. Hit me with a Stormlight Archive explained badly.
Coming from Ryan, who wrote in earlier as well. He said, imagine Tony Stark born on a planet with giant crabs, but instead of technology, he has access to fairy magic.
I've heard a lot of Marvel comparisons.
Of course. Very obviously.
Popular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talk about Thanos a lot, and if not Marvel, then it's Game of Thrones or Harry Potter. Those are like the 3 go-tos. I think that I do like this because of the imagery that we see of Kaladin and like the new ability that he has to project his armor around other people.
Cool.
That was always like a Iron Man aspect because he had multiple suits and he could like send them out to protect people and whatnot. So definitely cool. Gotta love the fairy magic. Thanks so much for listening along. Brooke, can you take us away?
Life before death.
Strength before weakness.
Journey before destination.